The morning sun filters through the windows of Dan Kim's bakery, casting a soft golden glow over the warm, inviting interior. The smell of fresh bread and pastries fills the air, a comforting reminder of the small legacy his parents left behind. His fingers move mechanically, expertly kneading dough. The process should be second nature by now, but today his thoughts are clouded with worry. Dan inherited his parents' bakery after they passed away unexpectedly, but with it came more than just recipes and equipment. He also inherited their enormous debt. The bakery was a family dream, a place where Dan's parents had worked tirelessly to create something special. But now it feels like a burden, weighing down on him every minute of the day. As an Omega, Dan knows life is more difficult for him. The world doesn't see him as strong or capable as alphas, and his quiet demeanor often leaves him overlooked, underestimated, even dismissed. The financial strain has only amplified these feelings, and Dan has found it hard to ask for help, even though his friends, like Emma, have offered. The doorbell jingles, signaling the arrival of unwanted visitors. Dan looks up, a chill crawling down his spine. 4 men in suits step inside, their cold gazes scanning the room like predators sizing up their prey. The leader, a tall man with sharp features and an air of authority, steps forward. His name is Aiden, Dan's creditor, the one who had made it clear that he would stop at nothing to collect the debt. Aiden's gaze sweeps over the bakery, his eyes dark and calculating, then rests on Dan. "Kim," he says, his voice smooth but commanding, "you've had more than enough time to pay up. It's time to settle your debt." Dan's throat tightens. He swallows hard, trying to steady his nerves. His heart races as he remembers the last conversation with his parents' loan officer, the one who had arranged the loan to cover the bakery's expansion. The loan sharks were merciless, and it was clear they'd never allow him the same leniency his parents had once been granted. "I'll pay you back soon," Dan says, his voice wavering slightly. "Just give me a little more time." His fingers tremble as he fiddles with the edge of the countertop, anxiety tightening around his chest. Aiden takes a step forward, his presence overwhelming. He doesn't respond at first, only studies Dan, his lips curling into a sly smile. There's something about the way Aiden looks at him, like Dan is just another commodity, something he can own and control. Aiden moves closer, and Dan's pulse quickens. The other men in the room stand still, watching the interaction with interest. "Dan," Aiden murmurs, his voice low, almost predatory, "you've always been appealing. Maybe you don't need to pay in money. Maybe there's another way to settle this debt." Dan freezes, his breath catching in his throat. He can feel Aiden's presence invading his space, the man's fingers trailing down his cheek as he speaks, the touch cold, deliberate. Aiden's fingers slide lower, moving with disturbing familiarity, until they cup Dan's rear. Dan flinches, his face flushing with a mix of horror and anger. "What are you doing?" Dan stammers, instinctively taking a step back. His skin crawls and his heart thunders in his chest. Aiden's smirk deepens as he gently pulls his hand away, still leaning in a little too close for comfort. "You don't need to pretend like this is all business, Dan. I've been interested in you for a while now." Dan takes a step back, pushing Aiden away with force, his heart hammering. "Don't touch me," he snaps, his voice rising with panic. "I'll pay you back. Just give me time. I'll find a way to do it." Aiden's eyes darken with annoyance, but he doesn't push back. He straightens up, adjusting his suit jacket as though nothing had happened. "You've got 1 month, he warns, his voice flat, almost bored. 1 month to pay the full amount, or we take more than just the bakery. You know what I mean." Dan feels the weight of Aiden's words settle over him like a heavy stone. He knows exactly what Aiden means. They won't stop until they have everything. Aiden turns and signals to the men to follow him. "We'll be back in a month, Kim. Don't disappoint us." As they exit, Dan stands frozen for a moment, his hands still trembling. The door shuts behind them with a heavy thud, and the bakery suddenly feels colder, more suffocating. He leans against the counter, trying to calm his racing heart, but the room feels too small, the walls closing in on him. He's trapped. No way out. No way to fix this on his own. The doorbell jingles again, this time with a much lighter sound. Dan doesn't even look up at first, too lost in his thoughts, but then Emma's voice rings out with cheerful excitement. Dan, you won't believe what I found." Dan glances up, startled, and sees his longtime friend Emma, a bright and bubbly presence in the otherwise bleak space. She holds a colorful flyer in her hands, waving it excitedly. "What is it, Emma?" Dan asks, his voice strained, still shaken by the visit from the loan sharks. "Look!" Emma exclaims, slapping the flyer down onto the counter in front of him. "There's a cooking competition. Grand prize $50,000. You could totally enter. This could be your chance to get out of this mess." Dan's eyes fall on the flyer. His gaze traces the bold lettering. Grand prize, $50,000, open to all chefs. No entry fee. The prize money could be the exact amount he needs to pay off the debt. But the doubt quickly settles in his chest. He hasn't been in a competition for years, and the pressure to succeed feels immense. "I don't know, Emma," Dan murmurs, the self-doubt creeping in. "What if I don't win? What if I mess up again?" He remembers his failures, the feeling of rejection when he tried to break into the professional chef world years ago. Emma's eyes soften, and she steps closer to him, her hands firmly resting on his shoulders. "Dan, you're amazing. You have what it takes. You've been making magic in this bakery for years. You don't have to worry about those idiots in the competition. You just need to show them what you've got." Dan looks down at the flyer in his hands, his thoughts whirling. He can't let everything his parents worked for slip away, especially now that he knows the consequences of failure. If he doesn't win, the debt will crush him, and the bakery too. He looks up at Emma, determination creeping back into his chest. "Okay," he says quietly. "I'll enter. I'll win this and save the bakery. I can't let it go. I won't give up." Emma grins, her eyes lighting up with pride. "That's the spirit. I'll help you however I can." Dan looks at the flyer again, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. This is his only chance. He can't afford to fail, not this time. Dan folds the flyer carefully and slips it into his pocket, the spark of resolve igniting within him. He may be an Omega, but this is his fight now, and he'll do whatever it takes to win. The road ahead won't be easy, but he's ready. He'll enter that competition and prove to everyone, especially himself, that he can make it on his own. As he takes a deep breath and turns back to the bakery, the weight of the world still sits on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long while, he feels like he might just have a way out. The sound of footsteps echoes in the large, gleaming kitchen as the contestants prepare for the first round of the prestigious cooking contest. The atmosphere is a mix of intense focus and barely contained nerves. The spotlight is on the kitchen, and in walks Ryan Carter, an alpha, a renowned star chef with a reputation that precedes him. His presence commands attention immediately. His sharp jawline and piercing eyes, framed by perfectly styled hair, leave a trail of whispers in his wake. Tall and confident, Ryan's charisma is undeniable, but it's his arrogance that leaves many wary. Dan watches Ryan from the sidelines, his heart racing. He's always admired Ryan from afar, ever since he first watched him on TV years ago. The way Ryan commands the kitchen, the ease with which he performs culinary magic. It's inspiring. For Dan, it was the only thing about Ryan that held any appeal, but it wasn't just Ryan's cooking skills that made him a household name. It was his charm, his ability to draw people in with his flirty smile, his boyish grin, his playboy persona that made everyone swoon, whether they were male or female. Dan, though, never understood the attraction. It wasn't that Ryan wasn't handsome or charismatic. It was just that the playboy lifestyle always seemed like a facade to Dan, something shallow and fleeting. Despite this, Dan had never met Ryan before, and the opportunity to finally see him in action was exciting. He had to admit, he was intimidated. He was a small-time baker competing against elite chefs, each one more skilled and experienced than him. The self-doubt crept in as he took in the expensive kitchens, the designer uniforms, and the whispers of the other contestants. The moment Dan stepped into the competition, he felt out of place. The other contestants, many of them, sized him up with disdain. They exchanged mocking glances when Dan set up his simple baking station, as though baking didn't belong in the same arena as haute cuisine. Dan could feel their eyes on him, and though he wanted to ignore them, it was hard to ignore the judgment in their stares. "Didn't know they let amateurs compete here," one contestant murmured, loud enough for Dan to hear, sending a flush of embarrassment through him. He was used to being underestimated, but it never made it easier to hear. "Don't let them get to you, Dan," Emma whispered from the sidelines, her voice full of encouragement. "You're better than they think. Remember why you're here. Do what you do best." Dan nodded, taking a deep breath. Emma had always been there for him, and if anyone believed in him, it was her. He had to trust in his skills, no matter how the others viewed him. He glanced over at Ryan, who was standing with the other judges, watching the contestants with a bored expression. The thought of impressing him seemed like a distant dream, but it still lingered in the back of Dan's mind. The first challenge was straightforward: create a signature dish that showcased the contestants' culinary strengths. While other chefs opted for intricate dishes involving exotic ingredients, Dan knew what he had to do. He would make something that was true to his heart, something he could pour his soul into. He began preparing a beautiful array of desserts, the smell of fresh pastries and delicate cream filling the air as he worked. Ryan's sharp eyes caught sight of Dan as he worked, and for the first time, the chef's gaze softened, a flicker of interest crossing his face. Dan's focus was complete. His hands moved deftly, his entire being absorbed in the rhythm of creation. The peace in his eyes as he worked was evident to Ryan. There was something pure about the way Dan approached cooking, something that reminded Ryan of when he had felt that way for the last time. But just as things seemed to be going smoothly, disaster struck. In his focus, Dan had overestimated the temperature on his oven, and one of his desserts began to burn. Panic coursed through his veins as he saw the time ticking down, and the seconds began to feel like minutes. He tried to salvage the burnt edges, but the clock was unforgiving. His hands shook with the pressure, and for a moment, it felt like everything he had worked for was crumbling before him. Emma, noticing his distress, yelled from the sidelines, "You got this, Dan! Don't give up now!" Dan heard her voice, grounding him just enough to regain some of his composure. He focused on her words, her faith in him reminding him of why he was there. With newfound determination, he quickly fixed the dessert, making the necessary adjustments to make it presentable, though it was far from perfect. His heart hammered in his chest as he plated his dish, hoping it would be enough to impress the judges. When it was Dan's turn to present his dish, his nerves threatened to undo him again. The judges, Ryan included, looked over the dessert, their expressions impassive. Dan stood there, heart-pounding, hoping they would see the effort he'd put in. He could feel the weight of their critical eyes on him. Ryan took the first bite, his face unreadable. The other judges followed suit, but no one said anything for a long moment. Finally, Ryan set his utensils down and looked at Dan with cold eyes. "You've done okay," Ryan said, his tone dismissive, "but it's not impressive. You're in a competition with professionals, not home cooks. If this is the best you can do, maybe it's time to reconsider cooking as a career." Dan's chest tightened, his cheeks burning with shame. The sting of Ryan's words cut deeper than any of the others. He had tried so hard, but it still wasn't enough. His confidence faltered, and he could feel the weight of failure settling over him. One of the other judges, an elderly woman with a kind face, smiled at Dan. "Don't be discouraged. Dear, you've got potential. Just give your best in the next round. You've still got time to improve." Dan nodded stiffly, trying to ignore the disappointment pooling in his stomach. As he turned away from the judges, he felt as though the entire room was closing in on him. He could hear the faint laughter of the other contestants behind him, and he felt that familiar sting of being an outsider. Ryan, however, didn't seem to care much about the other contestants' reactions. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking between the remaining contestants. There was a certain disinterest in his eyes, like he'd seen it all before and nothing impressed him anymore. Still, something about Dan lingered in his thoughts. It wasn't just the desserts. It was the way Dan's passion had shown through, how he had pushed past his mistakes, even when everything seemed to fall apart. That was something Ryan hadn't seen in years, the kind of passion that made him fall in love with cooking in the first place. But it was fleeting. Ryan quickly dismissed the thought and shifted his focus back to the other contestants. The game, after all, was still just a game, and he was too busy with his own world to get caught up in others' struggles. Dan's heart ached, but he knew he couldn't let Ryan's harsh words define him. He would fight through this, just as he had with every other challenge in his life. Emma's encouragement still rang in his ears, and though the competition had shaken him, he knew there was more to him than what the judges saw. There was a fire within him, and he wasn't going to let it go out. But as he looked up from his station, he couldn't help but wonder, did Ryan Carter see more in him than just another competitor, or was he just another face in a sea of contestants? A week has passed since the first task of the competition, and Dan has somehow managed to survive the intense rounds. Now, standing before the judges at the finale, he feels both a sense of anticipation and dread. Only one more dish separates him from the grand prize, and the money he so desperately needs to save his bakery. The tension in the air is palpable as the contestants await their final challenge. Dan, knowing this is his last chance, decides to pull out all the stops. He's been saving his trump card for this moment. A recipe passed down through generations, taught to him by his grandmother. It was a recipe that had been a bestseller at his bakery since the first time it was baked. A dish so beloved that it became the talk of the town. When his grandmother had baked it, it had flown off the shelves, and Dan hoped it could do the same for him today. With great care and precision, Dan prepares the dessert, putting everything he has into it. As the ingredients come together, he can almost hear his grandmother's voice guiding him, as though she were there beside him. It feels like he's honoring her legacy with each step, and he pours all of his love for his family and his craft into the dish. The moment Dan presents his dessert to the judges, there's a noticeable shift in the room. As Ryan takes the first bite, his eyes narrow, and an almost imperceptible flicker of recognition crosses his face. The taste, Dan's dessert, immediately takes him back to his childhood. It's the same recipe his grandmother used to make, the same one she used to bring him when he was a young boy, sitting at their family kitchen table. Ryan grips Dan's hands suddenly, shocking everyone in the room, including the other judges and the audience. There's a moment of stunned silence as the crowd holds its breath. "Where did you learn this recipe?" Ryan demands, his voice intense, his gaze locked on Dan's. "Who taught you this?" Before Dan can respond, the other judges remind Ryan that they're in the middle of the competition, but the tension in the air remains thick. Ryan releases Dan's hands reluctantly, but his eyes remain fixed on him. The other judges, still processing the dish, begin to compliment Dan. They praise the texture, the balance of flavors, the harmony between ingredients. They call it a well-crafted dessert that reflects Dan's true talent. Dan feels a swell of pride as he listens to the judges. The praise is more than he expected, and it's enough to make him feel like he's honored his grandmother's memory. He can't help but smile, though his heart still races with the uncertainty of what will come next. It's time for the results, and Dan can feel the weight of the moment. His hand trembles in Emma's grip as they stand together, waiting to hear who will take home the grand prize. Dan's heart pounds in his chest, the noise of the crowd around him fading into a blur. As the judges announce the winners, Dan's stomach twists. His name isn't called. His heart sinks, and a deep sense of loss washes over him. Emma, sensing his distress, immediately reaches out to comfort him, but Dan pulls away, devastated. This had been his only chance to save his bakery, and he had failed. "What am I going to do now?" he murmurs, the weight of his debt pressing down on him. He feels utterly defeated. Emma tries to console him, but her words don't reach him. He can't focus on anything else except the crushing disappointment. "Leave me alone for a bit," he says, his voice tinged with frustration and sorrow. Emma hesitates, but nods, giving him the space he needs. Dan stumbles out of the competition hall, heart heavy, thoughts scattered. He returns to his bakery, feeling like a failure. As he sits at the small table in the quiet shop, the door chimes, snapping him out of his thoughts. He looks up, and his stomach drops. It's Aiden, the loan shark. Aiden steps into the bakery, his presence as imposing as ever. He walks over to Dan, and without a word, demands the payment that Dan owes him. "Time's up," Aiden sneers, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I need the money now." Dan, still reeling from his defeat at the competition, pleads with Aiden. "Please, I just need more time. I'll get the money, I swear." Aiden's lips curl into a smirk. "No can do, sweetheart. No hard feelings. It's all business," he says. Then with a wicked glint in his eyes, he adds, "Or we can always visit the other arrangement we talked about." He grabs Dan's hand, his grip tight and possessive. Dan yanks his hand away, panic rising in his chest. "Let go of me," he protests, but Aiden's grip is like iron. Dan's heart races as Aiden steps closer, towering over him. Just as things seem to take a darker turn, the door chimes again, and a commanding voice cuts through the tension. "Let him go." Dan's breath catches as he looks up to see Ryan standing in the doorway, his presence undeniable. There's something intense in Ryan's expression, an unmistakable aura of authority. Ryan's alpha pheromones fill the room, and Dan can feel the force of them washing over him. Aiden raises an eyebrow. "And who are you?" he sneers, not yet releasing his hold on Dan. Ryan steps forward, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't like repeating myself. Let him go." His tone is almost a growl. Aiden hesitates, but then signals to his men to step forward, and a fight breaks out. Dan watches in shock as Ryan swiftly takes down Aiden's men, his moves fast and controlled. Dan can hardly believe what he's witnessing. Ryan, the charming, aloof chef, was now standing in front of him, fighting off the very people who had come to collect his debt. Aiden, now beaten and furious, attempts to charge at Ryan, but Ryan grabs him by the hair, pulling him up to face him. "Now tell me, why are you here?" Ryan demands, his grip tightening. Aiden spits out, "He owes me money. I'm just here to collect what's mine." "How much?" Ryan asks, his voice steady, his grip still firm on Aiden's hair. $50,000, Aiden growls, his defiance clear. Without a word, Ryan pulls out a checkbook, writes out the amount, and hands it to Aiden. "Stay far away from Dan and his bakery," he warns, his tone cold and final. Aiden, now defeated, storms out, leaving Ryan and Dan alone in the bakery. Dan stands frozen in place, still processing everything that has just transpired. "What was that?" he asks, his voice a mixture of confusion and awe. "What are you doing here? Why did you do that?" Ryan, unfazed by the question, walks over to a chair and sits down casually. "Is this how you treat someone who just helped you?" he asks with a smirk. Dan, still reeling from the shock of it all, shoots back, "I didn't ask for your help." He crosses his arms, his frustration evident. "Besides, I want answers." Ryan leans back, a playful smile tugging at his lips. "I'm here to see you. I helped you because I can, and because I'm rich," he says nonchalantly. Dan, now even more confused, blinks. "What?" Ryan chuckles. "See how much I've suffered just to help you? Aren't you going to treat me now?" Dan, exasperated, turns to the counter and grabs the first aid kit. "I didn't ask you to," he mutters as he walks back toward Ryan. Dan tends to Ryan's wounds, patching him up as best as he can. "Thanks," Dan says quietly, though there's still a lot on his mind. And Ryan smiles, his eyes glinting. Don't worry, I'll make sure you pay me back. Every penny. Ryan takes out his phone and inputs his number into Dan's, calling himself to ensure he has his contact info. He stands, ready to leave. I'll be in touch, he says, nonchalantly slipping his phone back into his pocket. As Ryan walks out, Dan stands there, stunned, unable to fully comprehend what just happened. He had been saved, but at what cost? What did Ryan really want from him? And why had he helped him at all? The questions swirl in his mind as the door closes behind Ryan, leaving Dan to wonder what comes next. Dan is still processing everything that happened with Ryan, his mind racing with questions. He's standing in the quiet of his bakery, his thoughts swirling in confusion, when the door chimes again. He looks up, startled, and sees Emma walking in. Dan, I just saw Ryan Carter walking out of the bakery. What was he doing here? Emma asks, her curiosity piqued. Dan sighs, rubbing his temples. He walks over to the counter, still grappling with the strange encounter. You're not going to believe it, he says, recounting everything to Emma. The payment he didn't ask for, the strange intervention, the fight, and Ryan's unexpected assistance. Emma listens, eyes wide with disbelief. So, he just swooped in and saved you? She says, still processing the bizarre turn of events. Maybe he likes you? Like love at first sight? Dan rolls his eyes, a look of disbelief on his face. Nonsense, he replies, shaking his head. You watch too many K-dramas, Emma. Emma insists. But think about it, Dan. Why would Ryan Carter, of all people, intervene for you? Maybe he does like you. She grins mischievously. Dan shakes his head again, trying to push the thought away. And even if what you're saying might be true, why would he be interested in me? I'm just a small-town baker, drowning in debt. I'm sure there's more to it than that, Emma presses, not giving up. Remember what he did at the last judging session? That reaction, it was really weird. Dan pauses, his mind flashing back to Ryan's intense gaze when he tasted the dessert. There was something in that moment, something that made Dan's heart race, but he quickly shakes off the thought. Yeah, it was strange, he says, still unsure of what to make of it, but that doesn't explain why he'd even be interested in me. Meanwhile, at the Carter estate, Ryan is caught in a far different dilemma. His grandfather, who has been ill for quite some time, calls for a family meeting. Ryan sits across from him in the grand living room, trying to mask the frustration on his face. His grandfather, frail but determined, looks at Ryan with intense eyes. Ryan, his grandfather says weakly, I'm not sure how much longer I have, but before I pass, I want to see you married. Ryan freezes, his expression hardening. Grandpa, I'm not ready for this, he protests. You know I've got too much going on, business, my career. I can't just drop everything for some marriage. But his grandfather's eyes soften with emotion, and he reaches out, placing a hand on Ryan's. I know, son, I know, but I'm worried about the family legacy. It's important that we have a proper heir. And besides, you've never truly settled down. You've always been running away from what's important. I just want to see you happy before I'm gone. Ryan sighs, feeling a tug of guilt. I can't promise you that, he says softly, though he can't bring himself to say no. His grandfather's frailty tugs at his heartstrings, and Ryan finds himself agreeing to something he hadn't planned on. Fine, I'll think about it. When will you bring your bride or groom to meet the family? His grandfather asks, his tone more hopeful than ever. Ryan hesitates. Soon, I'll make sure you meet them soon, he replies, unsure of how this will all play out. As Ryan walks away from the meeting, his thoughts are in turmoil. He's not ready to settle down. He's not the type for commitment, and the very idea of a traditional marriage feels suffocating. But his grandfather's words echo in his mind, pulling at him. He needs to do something, and fast. Ryan sits down at his desk, picking up his phone. He dials his secretary, Ethan, a no-nonsense kind of guy who always has a solution. Ethan, I need you to find a way out of this, Ryan says, his voice rough. My grandfather wants me married, but I can't do it. I need to get this over with quickly, without any emotional attachment. There's a long pause on the other end before Ethan responds. Well, sir, there is always the option of a contract marriage. It could fulfill the family obligations, and you wouldn't have to get emotionally involved. Ryan thinks for a moment, then a smile creeps onto his face. A contract marriage? That's actually not a bad idea. It solves everything. I can fulfill my grandfather's wish and get out of it without any hassle. Ryan leans back in his chair, a plan beginning to form. Ethan, I need you to draw up the contract. I'll need someone who won't cause trouble, someone I can control. Ethan's voice is professional. I'll get on it right away, sir. Who would you like to propose to? Ryan thinks for a moment, then a thought strikes him. With a smirk, Ryan says, I have someone in mind.